Luxor, Egypt, 1903. Howard Carter is standing in front of a wall, and something is wrong with it. He has spent enough years in this valley to know what a complete Egyptian wall looks like. He knows the rhythm of these images, the way figures stand in relation to each other, the way hieroglyphs flow around them in their careful columns. What he is looking at right now does not have that rhythm. There are gaps, not the kind of gaps that time makes. Stone does not forget in clean outlines. Stone cracks, flakes, fudges ingredients. What Carter is looking at was done with tools, by hands, on purpose. The outline of a human form, carefully excised. Hieroglyphs that begin, then stop, then begin again, around a space where other hieroglyphs used to be. Someone took a name off this wall. He has seen erasures before. Egypt is full of them, but this one stops him, and it takes him a moment to understand why. The erasure is too careful. Whoever did this was not angry. Anger leaves ragged edges. Broken stone, the evidence of force without patience. What Carter is looking at was done slowly. The way you remove something you want gone, but cannot afford to destroy. Because the wall it sits on is still a wall you need, and the temple around it is still a temple people use. And the only option available to you is to make the person disappear while leaving the architecture standing. He studies the shape of what is missing. The figure was always shown in the same position, always holding the same things, always wearing the same crown. The crown of a pharaoh. He crouches down, in the debris at his feet, almost invisible under the dust. A fragment of painted limestone catches the light. He picks it up. On it, perfectly preserved, is part of a face, formal, precise. The careful lines around the eye that artists in this valley had been painting the same way for 1,000 years. The face is looking at something he cannot see. He holds it for a long moment. What kind of person do you have to be to earn an erasure this careful? What kind of ruler makes the people who come after so uncomfortable that they sit down with chisels and remove you from stone? Not in a rage, but with the patience of people who have decided this needs to be done correctly. He sets the fragment down. He does not know her name yet. That will take another 2 decades. More excavation, more fragments pulled from rubble that someone put there on purpose. He does not know that the pits near this temple contain hundreds of broken statues, smashed and buried with the same deliberate care as the erasure above him. He only knows what the wall is telling him right now. Someone was here, someone powerful enough that the record of an entire civilization was adjusted to remove her. And whatever was done to make her disappear, it was not quite enough. The face in his hand is still looking at something. Her name was Hatshepsut, and this is her story. There is something you need to understand about Egypt in the early 1500s, before the Common Era. Before we talk about anyone who lived inside it, Egypt at this moment was not ancient. That sounds wrong. By the time Hatshepsut was born, the pyramids at Giza had been standing for over 1,000 years. The hieroglyphic writing system was already centuries old. The concept of the pharaoh as divine king had been running long enough that most Egyptians alive in 1500 before the Common Era had never known a world without it. So yes, ancient, in that sense, but the Egypt Hatshepsut was born into was also, in a way that mattered enormously for her story, brand new. The 18th dynasty had been in power for roughly 3 generations, and it existed because of a war of liberation against an occupying power called the Hyksos. who had controlled northern Egypt for over 100 years. They came from the Levant. They brought the horse-drawn chariot and the composite bow, and they used that technology to hold the Nile Delta and much of Lower Egypt for more than a century. Think about what 100 years of occupation does to a civilization's sense of itself. The pharaohs who drove the Hyksos out were not simply fighting a military campaign. They were fighting for the idea that Egypt was supposed to be whole, that there was a correct version of their world. And the correct version did not include foreign kings sitting on Egyptian soil. The war to expel the Hyksos was the kind of war that leaves marks on a civilization long after the fighting stops. The way a bone that breaks and heals is never quite the same bone it was before, when the last Hyksos had been pushed out of Egypt and into Canaan. Egypt was not simply victorious, it was hungry. This is the world Thutmose I walked into when he became pharaoh, and he was precisely the right kind of person for that particular historical moment, which is both a credit to him and a warning about the world his daughter was going to be born into. He pushed Egypt's borders further than they had ever gone, north into Syria, all the way to the Euphrates River, a body of water so far from Thebes that Egyptian soldiers who reached it stood at its banks in genuine confusion, because the Euphrates flows south to north rather than north to south, like every river they had ever seen. He called it the inverted water. Then he drove south into Nubia with the same relentless energy, pushing Egyptian control deeper into sub-Saharan Africa than it had ever reached. He was building an empire, not maintaining one, building one, from the momentum of a civilization that had just spent a century being diminished and was now, with considerable force, in the process of overcorrecting into this palace, into this particular moment, defined above everything else by expansion and military ambition and the Egyptian appetite to prove itself. Hatshepsut was born. Her mother was Ahmose, the great royal wife, the principal queen, which meant Hatshepsut carried the most legitimate bloodline available in the most powerful dynasty Egypt had produced in generations. She was royal on both sides in the way that mattered, with the concentrated lineage of a family that had fought its way to the top and knew exactly what bloodlines were worth. She was also a girl. The easy thing to do here is write the sentence about how being a girl meant she could never be pharaoh, how the system was designed to exclude her, how the odds were stacked against her from birth. That sentence is not exactly wrong, but it misses something important about what a royal daughter actually meant in 18th dynasty Egypt. Power in ancient Egypt did not flow through a simple line. The great royal wife mattered. The daughter of the pharaoh mattered. Royal blood carried legitimacy in ways that were complicated and sometimes contradictory. But the core idea was this: the closer you were to divine kingship, the more of that divinity was considered to live in your body. Hatshepsut, as the daughter of Thutmose I and his great royal wife, was as close to the source of divine Egyptian kingship as a human being could get. She was not positioned far from the throne. She was positioned right next to it. The distinction between standing next to something and possessing it would define the first 30 years of her life. And then it would stop defining her, because she would redefine it herself. But that is still years away. There is a scribe somewhere in the palace complex at Thebes who is keeping the household accounts of Thutmose I's reign. He writes Hatshepsut's name with the full honorifics of her station: daughter of the pharaoh, possessor of divine favor. She appears in his records because her existence is a fact that needs to be noted. He writes her name in the column for royal daughters and moves on to the next item on his list. He has no way of knowing that the name he is writing belongs to a person who will make every list like this one permanently insufficient. Those answers were about to meet a problem they were not designed to handle. The problem was a person who would spend 30 years learning exactly how the system worked, and then use everything she learned to become something the system had no category for. The question her life would eventually force Egypt to answer is the same question it forces us to answer now. How do you occupy a position that the world around you has decided you cannot hold, using nothing but the tools the world gave you? She answered it in stone. We are still reading the answer. There is a particular kind of intelligence that develops in people who are placed close to power but not inside it. It is not the intelligence of the person who inherits the throne. That kind of intelligence has a specific shape, formed by the assumption that authority is available when you reach for it, that the room will quiet when you speak, that the question of whether you have the right to act has already been settled before you walk in. The intelligence that develops in people who stand close, but not inside, is different. It is the intelligence of observation, of learning to read a system so completely that you understand not just what it does, but what it is afraid of, where its edges are, and what would happen if someone pressed on those edges in exactly the right way. Hatshepsut spent her childhood building that second kind of intelligence. She was educated, which was not unusual for royal daughters of the 18th dynasty. She learned to read and write hieroglyphs, which was not a simple skill. The hieroglyphic writing system is one of the most complex scripts ever developed, with hundreds of individual signs, each carrying multiple possible meanings depending on context and combination. Mastering it was the work of years. She learned the religious texts, the prayers, the ritual formulas, the specific language of ceremony that was not decorative language but functional language, words believed to do actual work in the world, to maintain the relationship between the human and the divine that was the foundation of everything Egypt understood about how reality was organized. She learned the music, the movement, the precise choreography of ritual that had been refined over centuries into something that looked like performance but was understood as mechanism. The correct operation of the universe, expressed through trained human bodies in the right place at the right time. All of this was the education of a royal daughter who would grow up to hold religious titles, to stand beside the pharaoh in the formal visual language of Egyptian public life. But here is what that education actually gave her, beyond what it was designed to give her. It gave her the interior of the system, the god's wife of Amun, the title that royal daughters held in the religious hierarchy of Thebes was not a ceremonial title in the empty sense. It carried real authority over real resources, real influence within the priestly establishment that managed one of the most powerful religious institutions in the ancient world. The Temple of Amun at Karnak was not simply a place of worship. It was a landowner, an employer, an economic engine that controlled a significant portion of Egypt's agricultural production and the labor of thousands of people. To hold a title within that system was to hold a key to something. Hatshepsut held that key from childhood, and she used it the way an exceptionally intelligent person uses any key they are handed before they are supposed to understand what it opens. Which is to say, she paid attention to every door. She watched her father govern. Thutmose, I was not an easy man to watch. He was the kind of ruler who filled a room with the specific gravity of someone who had made life and death decisions and would make them again without losing sleep. He was a man defined by action, by the outward expression of power in its most legible form. But Hatshepsut did not watch his campaigns. She watched how he governed. She watched the way officials brought him information and how he evaluated what they brought. She watched decisions move through the court. how a directive issued in the throne room became a reality in a distant province through layers of administrators who each translated it slightly as it passed through their hands. She watched what happened when the translation went wrong. She was watching the architecture of power, not the facade, not the public performance of pharaonic authority designed for audiences and temple walls. The actual architecture, the joints and the load-bearing elements and the places where, if you applied pressure correctly, the structure moved. Most children who grow up in powerful households do not see this. They see the facade because the facade is what adults show children. But Hatshepsut was in the temple and in the ceremony and in the spaces where the business of governance happened before it was polished for presentation. And she was there young enough and observant enough that she built a map of the system before she was old enough to have reasons to want to use it. There was an older priestess in the service of Amun, one of the women responsible for training the young royal daughters in the requirements of the god's wife role. She taught Hatshepsut the prayers, the ritual movements, the precise intonation of the ceremonial language. What she noticed was that Hatshepsut did not learn the way other students learned. Most students learned the ritual as ritual. They memorized the words as words, the movements as movements. They learned the correct form without necessarily engaging with the question of what the form was for. Hatshepsut asked what it was for. She asked why this prayer used these specific words and not other words that seemed to mean the same thing. She asked why the ritual moved in this direction at this moment in the ceremony. The older priestess answered what she could. When she could not answer, she said so. She probably thought she was teaching a girl who would grow up to be an exceptionally devout and capable royal wife. Someone who would perform the rituals with deep understanding, who would be a genuine asset to the religious life of the court. She was right. She was also missing the larger picture by a distance that no one at that time could have measured, because what Hatshepsut was building, question by question, observation by observation, was not simply knowledge of how the religious system worked. She was building an understanding of how legitimacy itself worked in Egypt, how it was constructed, what it rested on, what the system understood as valid authority and what it understood as its opposite, and how the line between those two things was maintained. Legitimacy in Egypt came from the gods. Specifically, it came from Amun. The pharaoh was legitimate because Amun had chosen that person, endorsed that person, made that person the living expression of divine will in the human world. The rituals Hatshepsut was learning were not peripheral to this legitimacy. They were the mechanism by which it was maintained and renewed. Every ceremony correctly performed was an act of re-establishing the connection between the divine order and the human order that depended on it. The person who controlled that mechanism controlled something more durable than an army. Hatshepsut did not articulate this to herself in these terms when she was a child, learning prayers in the shadow of the Karnak temple complex. But knowledge does not always arrive as explicit understanding. Sometimes it arrives as a feeling for how things work, a feel for the weight and the balance of a system that only becomes conscious later when circumstances force it to the surface. Circumstances were coming. The Egyptian language had a word for king. It had a word for queen. It had words for royal daughter, for God's wife, for great royal wife. For every position a woman of Hatshepsut's standing could occupy in the formal hierarchy of Egyptian society, what it did not have was a word for what she was becoming, for the person standing at the edge of a role that was not designed for her, learning everything about that role from the inside, understanding it at a depth that most people who formerly held it never reached. The language would have to catch up with her later. For now, she was still learning, still watching, still building the map. And the map, as she drew it, had more rooms in it than anyone around her imagined she could see. Thutmose I died, and the throne passed to his son. The son was Thutmose too, born from a secondary wife rather than from the great royal wife Ahmose, which meant he carried the paternal line clearly, but the maternal legitimacy, the royal blood that ran purest through Hatshepsut, was not his in the same way. The Egyptian system had a solution for this kind of gap. Hatshepsut married him. She became his great royal wife. The woman standing beside the pharaoh in the ceremonial language of the court, in the images on the temple walls, in the formal titles that defined who mattered in the Egyptian world and how much. By marrying Thutmose II, she completed his legitimacy with her own bloodline, and in doing so, she moved from being the daughter of power to being the wife of power, which sounds like a step sideways. It was not. The great royal wife in 18th dynasty Egypt was not a decorative position. She was the woman whose image appeared on the temple walls alongside the pharaoh. She participated in the royal rituals that maintained the cosmic order. She was the woman whose legitimate children would be the legitimate heirs. In the visual and symbolic language of Egyptian public life, she was the other half of the pharaonic image, not equal, but present, visible, part of what Egyptian kingship looked like to the people and the gods it was performed for. Hatshepsut, standing in that position beside Thutmose II, was now at the center of the formal record of Egypt in a way she had not been as a royal daughter. And Thutmose II gave her something else without knowing he was giving it. He gave her contrast. He was not his father. The evidence for his reign is thin in ways that are themselves evidence. He did not build the monuments that Thutmose I built. He did not campaign with the ambition that Thutmose I campaigned with. The records suggest a reign of perhaps 3 to 13 years, a range that tells you historians are working with fragments. What they tend to agree on is that it was not a long reign, and not a reign that left a strong impression on the physical landscape of Egypt. The examination of his mummy suggests he may have suffered from a chronic skin condition that indicates possible underlying health problems. What is clear is that when he died, he left behind an empire and a child. The child was a boy named Thutmose, who would become Thutmose III. But this child was not born from Hatshepsut. He was born from a secondary wife named Iset, which meant that when Thutmose II died and this child became the nominal pharaoh, the child's mother was not the great royal wife. Hatshepsut was the great royal wife. Hatshepsut had given Thutmose IV a daughter. Her name was Neferu, a girl with a beautiful name and a significant ceremonial role in her mother's court, but a girl in a system that needed a boy for the throne. So when Thutmose II died, what Egypt had was a child pharaoh with complicated legitimacy, a mother who was not the great royal wife, and a great royal wife who was the daughter of the most consequential pharaoh the 18th dynasty had produced, who had spent her entire life inside the system of royal authority, learning everything there was to know about how it worked. The system looked at this situation and did what systems do when they need something to function in the absence of the person supposed to be running it. It reached for Hatshepsut. There is a moment somewhere in the weeks after Thutmose II died, in the administrative heart of the most powerful kingdom in the ancient world, when the officials who ran the daily business of Egyptian governance had to figure out who they were actually going to talk to when they needed a decision made. The grain system did not pause for royal transitions. The temples did not pause. The diplomatic correspondence with Nubia and the Levantine city-states did not pause. Egypt was an empire of several million people, and it required continuous management. And there was a child on the throne. The officials did not make a dramatic choice. They made a practical one. They went to Hatshepsut, and Hatshepsut, who had spent her entire life watching how this system worked, who had mapped every room in the architecture of Egyptian power, who had been preparing for precisely this kind of moment, without knowing she was preparing for it, picked up the work. She always picked up the work. The role she stepped into was called regent. It was supposed to be temporary. That was the understood arrangement, the implicit contract between a regent and the system that installed one. You hold the throne warm for the child who is not yet ready to sit on it. You keep the machinery running. You do not accumulate authority for yourself, because the authority you are holding belongs to the child. She understood all of this. She also understood something that the arrangement had not fully accounted for. Power does not stay where it is told to stay. It goes to the person doing the work. Here is something true about temporary power that no one who grants it ever wants to admit. It is only temporary if the person holding it agrees to give it back. That sounds cynical. It is meant to be precise, because the history of regencies, across every civilization that has ever needed one, is the history of a recurring human problem. You give someone authority because the situation requires it. You tell them the authority is conditional and limited and will be returned when circumstances allow, and then you discover that the circumstances are messier than the arrangement anticipated. The child is slow to mature. The emergency extends longer than expected. The person holding the authority turns out to be better at using it than anyone around them, which means the practical cost of returning it keeps rising. Or the person holding the authority simply discovers, somewhere in the quiet of their own understanding, that the arrangement was never going to be as clean as everyone pretended. Hatshepsut's regency began in the expected way. The documents from the earliest period after Thutmose II's death show the correct formal arrangement. Thutmose III is named Pharaoh. His name appears in the royal cartouche, the oval ring of hieroglyphs that marked the king's name as sacred and protected. Hatshepsut appears in her role as regent, as the adult member of the royal family responsible for governing in the child's name. The imagery is correct. The titles are correct. The administrative structure is correct. And underneath all of that correctness, the actual business of governing an empire is being conducted by one person. Think about what that business actually looked like. Egypt, in the 1500s, before the Common Era, was a civilization of somewhere between 3 and 5 million people, stretched along the length of the Nile from the Mediterranean coast to the Fourth Cataract deep in Nubia. The grain that fed the population was grown, collected, stored, and redistributed through a system of royal granaries that required continuous management. The temples that maintained the religious life of the country, and that were also major economic institutions, required oversight. The military that protected the borders and projected Egyptian power into Nubia and the Levant required direction. None of this paused because the pharaoh was a child. Hatshepsut managed it. She managed it in the way that becomes visible in the archaeological record, not through dramatic announcements, but through accumulation. The building projects that continued, the trade expeditions that were organized, the administrative correspondence that kept moving, the evidence of a government that was not stumbling, not contracting, not retreating into minimum functionality while it waited for adult leadership. Egypt, under the early Regency, was not holding its breath. It was operating. The officials who ran the daily machinery of Egyptian governance were pragmatic people. They had to be. These were men who had built careers on identifying where actual decisions were being made and aligning themselves accordingly. They were not being disloyal to Thutmose III. They were doing what the system required them to do. And the system required them to go to the person who had answers when they needed answers. That person was Hatshepsut. She understood the temple economy. She understood the administrative structure of the provinces. She understood the diplomatic relationships that Egypt maintained with its neighbors and the specific languages, not just linguistic languages, but the languages of ceremony and gift and strategic ambiguity, in which those relationships were conducted. She had spent her entire life building this understanding, and now she had the authority to use it somewhere outside of Thebes. There was a regional official responsible for one of the agricultural districts along the Nile. His name appears in several administrative documents from this period. Though the documents themselves are not remarkable enough to have attracted significant scholarly attention, he received directives from the royal court. He executed them. He sent back his reports. The correspondence was formally correct in every detail, acknowledging the pharaoh, Thutmose III, but the decisions reflected in those directives, the specific priorities they expressed, the way they followed up on details from his previous reports with the attention of someone who had actually read them carefully. Those were not the decisions of a child. He knew who was actually reading his reports. He served the pharaoh, Thutmose III. He wrote to Hatshepsut. He did not find this contradiction troubling, because troubling contradictions were a luxury for people who could afford to spend time on them. He had grain to account for, and labor to organize, and a district to run. He did his job. Egypt kept moving. And in the palace at Thebes, in the administrative heart of the operation, a woman who had been handed temporary authority was discovering something that the people who handed it to her had not fully calculated. She was better at this than anyone else available. Not better in the way that flatters. Better in the way that the system itself demonstrated. Day after day. In the functioning of an empire that required continuous, competent management and was receiving it. The treasury was being managed. The building projects were moving forward. The borders were secure. The diplomatic relationships were holding. Egypt worked because she made it work, and the longer it worked, the more the work became inseparable from the person doing it. Not because she was accumulating power deliberately, reaching for more than she had been given, because power in any complex system tends to accumulate around competence the way water tends to accumulate in low places. It does not require intention. It requires only the continuous reality of who is solving the problems when the problems arrive. She was always the one solving the problems, growing up in that court, watching all of this from a distance that was never quite far enough to be comfortable, was Thutmose III. He was a child when the regency began. By the middle years of it, he was becoming something else. The military training that the 18th dynasty considered essential for any pharaoh who wanted to be taken seriously was producing, in this particular young man, someone who was paying attention, not just to his training, to everything around him. He was watching the gap between his name on the documents and the person whose decisions on the documents actually reflected. He was not a fool. He was not a child anymore. He understood what he was seeing. He also understood something that made the watching bearable, which was that the situation contained within it a resolution that did not require him to force anything. She was older than him. That was not a political calculation. It was a biological fact with political implications that he would have been aware of from the time he was old enough to understand them. He trained He waited. He watched a woman run the most powerful empire in the world with a competence that he could not honestly dispute. And, somewhere in the accumulation of days that made up the regency years, the question that had always been implicit in the arrangement, the question of when temporary became something else, was quietly becoming the most important question in Egypt. Nobody was ready to ask it out loud yet, but the regency was changing shape. Everyone could feel it. There is a room in the palace at Thebes. It is not the throne room, not the audience hall where officials wait with their reports and their carefully managed expressions, not the ceremonial spaces where the business of the Egyptian court performs itself for the people and the gods it is performed for. This room is smaller, a preparation room, the kind that exists in every palace and every temple in Egypt. The space where the transition happens between the ordinary person and the role the ordinary person is about to inhabit in public. Where the costume goes on, where the person who will walk out into the formal world is assembled from the pieces that the formal world requires. It is night. The lamps are burning low. The palace around this room is quiet in the way that palaces are quiet before a day that everyone knows will be different from the days before it. Hatshepsut is alone. On the table in front of her are the pieces of what she is going to put on in the morning. The nemes, headcloth, the striped linen, that is the visual shorthand for pharaonic authority, the image on every sphinx, on every formal representation of Egyptian kingship that has ever been made, the double crown, the crook and the flail, and the false beard, the ceremonial element that the pharaoh wore in formal ritual contexts, not as a disguise, not as a claim to be something she was not, but as the costume of the role itself, the signifier that said, this person is operating in the capacity of king. She has put these pieces on in their individual forms before. She has held the crook in ceremonial contexts. She has worn the headdress in certain ritual functions, but not all of them together, not in the complete assembly that constitutes the full visual statement of the pharaonic role. Not as pharaoh. Tomorrow she will walk out of this room and into the formal life of the court and the temples and the administrative apparatus of the most powerful empire in the ancient world. And she will be doing it not as regent, not as great royal wife, not as the woman governing in the name of the child on the throne, but as pharaoh, with the full titles, the full imagery, the full theological weight of the role that Egypt had understood for over 2,000 years, to be filled by a specific kind of person, a kind of person she is not, a kind of person she is about to become anyway. She picks up the false beard. It is lighter than it looks. She holds it in her hand for a moment, not putting it on yet, just holding it, outside the room, somewhere in the palace complex. The night is moving toward the hour before dawn, when everything is at its most silent. When the ordinary world pauses in the specific way, it pauses just before it begins again. She sets the beard down. She picks up the nemes headcloth instead, and she puts it on, adjusting it with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been wearing ceremonial dress since childhood. Then the crown, then the crook and the flail, one in each hand. She looks at what she has assembled. Then she picks up the beard and puts it on too. There is a polished surface across the room, a sheet of polished bronze that reflects enough for a person to see themselves in the approximate terms of their own outline, their own shape, the general composition of what they look like to the world. She looks. What she sees is a pharaoh of Egypt. The costume is complete. The visual language is correct in every detail. Any Egyptian who looked at this image would read it immediately as the image of the king. the living Horus, the divine figure at the center of the cosmic order that held their world together. The image is correct. The person inside it is a woman who is somewhere around 40 years old, who has spent her entire life standing next to this role and watching it from close enough to understand it better than almost anyone who has ever held it, who is about to walk out of this room and claim it in full for the first time. She stands there for a moment that has no particular length. Then she breathes the way people breathe when they have made a decision that cannot be unmade. When the door behind them has just closed and the door in front of them is the only door left, she is ready. She turns away from her own reflection to face what comes next. The statues begin to shift in the following months. The images on the temple walls begin to change. In the same hieroglyphic inscription, sometimes in the same sentence. The texts about Hatshepsut shift between grammatical gender. She is referred to with feminine pronouns, and then with masculine pronouns, and then with feminine pronouns again. Sometimes within a single carved passage, as if the scribes who produced them are doing exactly what they are doing, which is using both, because neither alone is sufficient. The language bent because it had to. A civilization with over 1,000 years of written record. A scribal tradition that placed enormous value on precision, on the correct word in the correct place, on the understanding that language was not merely descriptive, but functional. That tradition, confronted with Hatshepsut, reached into its full vocabulary and found it insufficient, and rather than force her into an existing category, it expanded. It made room for her. She held 5 primary titles as pharaoh: the Horus name, the 2 ladies' name, the golden Horus name, the throne name, the birth name. Every pharaoh since the early dynastic period had held versions of these titles. Hatshepsut held them in forms that were neither cleanly masculine nor cleanly feminine, but something that the tradition produced in the act of trying to describe what was standing in front of it. Her throne name was Matkare. Truth is the soul of Ra. The claim that the pharaoh's role was to embody and maintain Ma'at, the principle of truth and order and right balance that held the Egyptian universe together. She was calling herself the king, and it begins in that room, in the hour before dawn. With a woman standing alone in the complete costume of the role she has decided she is actually filling, breathing once, and then turning away from her own reflection to face what comes next. Every story about power has a person in it who does not hold the title but holds the work. Not a shadow ruler, not someone pulling strings from behind a curtain. Something more honest than that, and more interesting. The person who understands what the person at the center is trying to build, who has the specific capability to help build it, and who makes a choice to put that capability entirely in service of someone else's vision. Justinian had Theodora, Elizabeth had Cecil, Hatshepsut had Senenmut. He appears in the historical record as if from nowhere. No family background of particular distinction. No obvious patronage network that explains his rise. He emerges in the documentation of Hatshepsut's reign already important, already holding significant responsibilities, already positioned close enough to the center that his name appears on major administrative documents alongside the name of the pharaoh. By the height of his career, he held more than 80 titles simultaneously. 80 titles in a system where titles were not honorifics, but functional designations, each corresponding to an actual responsibility within the Egyptian administrative and religious structure. Steward of Ammon, steward of the queen, overseer of the granaries, overseer of the fields, overseer of the cattle, overseer of the gardens, tutor to the royal daughter Neferua, chief architect of the royal building program. He was, in the most practical sense available, running the machinery of Hatshepsut's Egypt. But here is the thing about Senenmut that the administrative record captures only partially. He was not simply executing orders. He was extending thinking. The buildings he designed were not buildings that a competent architect would design for any patron who asked for something impressive. They were buildings that reflected a specific understanding of what Hatshepsut was trying to accomplish politically and theologically and historically, and translated that understanding into stone with a precision that required him to know not just what she wanted, but why she wanted it. To know the why. You have to be inside the vision. And to be inside the vision, you have to believe in it. There is a morning somewhere in the middle years of the reign. Senenmut is at the construction site of Deir el-Bahri, which is still in its early stages. Still a landscape of cut stone and workers, and the controlled chaos of a major building project taking shape from plans into physical reality. He has been here since before dawn, which is when he tends to arrive, partly because the light in the early morning tells him things about the surfaces and the angles that midday light obscures, and partly because the site is quieter then, and he thinks more clearly when it is quiet. He is standing at a specific point on the lower terrace, the point from which the full relationship between the building and the cliff face behind it is most visible. The cliffs are catching the first light. The limestone is doing the thing it does in the early morning, holding the light briefly before it gives it back. That quality of seeming briefly interior, rather than simply reflective, he has calculated where this light will be at every hour of the day, across every season of the year. He has worked out the angles of the colonnades, the proportion of the terraces, the orientation of the whole structure relative to the east and to the processional route of Amun that will, on the correct day, in the correct season, align with the axis of the building, as if the god were walking toward a door that was built to receive him. He knows exactly what this building will be when it is finished. He also knows something else, something that the technical calculations do not capture, but that is present in every decision he has made about this site. This building is an argument, not a modest argument, not a careful one, an argument made in the most permanent medium available, at the largest scale that the resources of an empire can support, on behalf of a person whose right to make arguments at this scale is itself what is being argued. Deir el-Bahri is not a monument to Hatshepsut's power. It is the proof of it. He turns from the cliff face and looks at the workers beginning to arrive for the day's work. Men who know their specific tasks without necessarily knowing the full shape of what they are building. That is how large projects work. You divide the vision into pieces small enough for individual human beings to execute, and you trust that the pieces will fit together into something larger than any of them can see from where they are standing. He holds the full shape. He is the only person on this site who does, besides her. Now, there is a question about Senenmut that has occupied scholars for as long as scholars have been paying attention to him, and it is the question that tends to get asked first whenever his name comes up, because it is the most legible question available, and also, in a specific way, the most insufficient one. Were they lovers? The graffiti near Deir el-Bahri, drawn by people who were contemporaries of both of them, depicts sexual content involving a figure identified as Senenmut. It is crude, as ancient graffiti tends to be. It is the kind of thing that people in every era produce when they want to say something about a powerful person that the official record would never permit. Graffiti requires a seed. It requires something in observable reality that makes the story feel plausible to the people telling it. Inside the sanctuary of Deir el-Bahari, in small chambers, accessible only to priests performing the inner rituals of the temple, Senenmut's image was carved into the walls, quietly, tucked behind doors that would be invisible when the doors were open. In a culture where the placement of a person's image in sacred space was a precise and intentional act, hiding your image in the innermost sanctuary of a temple you built for someone else is not a neutral thing to do. It is an act of claiming closeness to something that the formal record does not quite account for. Here is the honest answer to the question of whether they were lovers. We do not know. The surviving evidence does not resolve it in either direction. Anyone who tells you confidently that they were, or confidently that they were not, is telling you something about their own interpretive preferences rather than about the evidence. But here is the question that matters more, and that the evidence does answer. Why did he do it? He was a man of extraordinary capability. The range of his titles alone tells you that the administrative complexity he was managing would have crushed a lesser intelligence. He could have built a career serving any pharaoh. He could have accumulated his competence and his reputation in ways that were safe, that did not attach his name to the most unprecedented reign in Egyptian history, that did not put him in the position of being the person most visibly associated with a ruler whose legitimacy was being constructed in real time. He chose not to do that. He went entirely in on Hatshepsut. He put his image in the hidden rooms of the temple he built for her. He held 80 titles in her service. He spent years of his life designing buildings whose purpose was to make her permanent. He poured the full force of his intelligence and his capability into making her vision real. The most credible explanation for this is also the one that the historical record supports most directly. He looked at what she was doing. He understood it in the way that only someone with genuine intelligence can understand a genuinely ambitious vision. From the inside, where the logic of it is visible and the necessity of it is clear. And he thought it was right, not personally right. Historically right, right in the sense that a civilization capable of producing Hatshepsut ought to be capable of receiving what she was offering, and that failing to receive it would be a failure of the civilization rather than a failure of the woman. He committed. There is one more detail in his story that deserves attention before we move on. His image was removed after Hatshepsut's death. Like hers, his presence in the formal record was subject to erasure. His statues were damaged. His name was removed from some inscriptions. The person who had held 80 titles and designed the building that still stands on the west bank of the Nile was made to be less visible, less legible, less present in the official account of what had happened during those decades. But his tomb survived. It is one of the largest private tombs from the 18th dynasty, cut into the cliffs near the Valley of the Kings, in a location that was an extraordinary honor for a man without royal blood. Inside it, his image is preserved. His name is preserved. He built his own record in stone, the way she built hers, and the stone remembered him the same way it remembered her. Imperfectly, partially, enough to know he existed and not quite enough to know who he was. The gaps in his record mirror the gaps in hers. That, more than anything else, tells you something true about how close they were. Walk into the second colonnade of Deir el-Bahari, and you will find something that no other pharaoh in Egyptian history put on a temple wall at this scale or with this level of detail. A birth story, not a metaphorical birth story, not a brief religious formula asserting divine parentage in the shorthand that the Egyptian ritual tradition sometimes used, A complete, sequential, illustrated narrative covering multiple panels, depicting in careful and deliberate detail the divine conception, gestation, birth, and recognition of the pharaoh Hatshepsut as the chosen child of the god Amun. The story begins with Amun, the king of the gods, deciding that the moment has come to place a great ruler on the throne of Egypt. He consults with Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, and Thoth tells him who the mother should be. The mother is Ahmose, the queen of Thutmose I. Amun disguises himself as Thutmose I and comes to Ahmose in the night. The fragrance of the god fills the room. What passes between them is depicted in the formal visual language of Egyptian sacred art, which is to say, with the careful encoding of a culture that understands these images, are doing theological work and treats them accordingly. The result of the encounter is a child. The child is Hatshepsut, Khnum, the god who fashions human beings on his potter's wheel, creates Hatshepsut and her Ka, her spiritual double, from divine materials. The gods of birth attend to the process. Amun announces to the assembled divine court that this child will rule Egypt, will be greater than any who came before, will bring prosperity and order and the favor of the gods to the land. The child is born. She is recognized. She is raised by divine nurses. She is presented to her father Thutmose I, who acknowledges her as his heir before the court. The story ends with Hatshepsut as pharaoh by divine appointment, chosen before birth, prepared throughout her life, finally standing in the role that the gods selected her for before she drew her first breath. Why? Now, the question that every modern reader of this story wants to ask first is, did she believe it? That is the wrong question. The right question is, what was this story doing? In the Egyptian theological framework, the pharaoh's authority was not political in the way that modern people understand political authority. It was not derived from conquest or hereditary succession alone. It was derived from the fact that the gods had chosen this person to be the living embodiment of Horus, the divine kingship, in the human world. The ritual that confirmed a new pharaoh was not a coronation in the secular sense. It was a process of recognition, of the divine nature within the pharaoh, being acknowledged and activated by the correct performance of the correct ceremonies. The pharaoh was not made divine by the ceremony. The ceremony revealed the divinity that was already there. This is the theological structure Hatshepsut was working within. She did not need Egypt to believe she had been physically conceived by a god in disguise. The texts themselves were clearly operating in the register of sacred narrative rather than historical chronicle. And the educated, religious, and administrative class of Egypt understood the difference between those registers. What she needed was for Egypt to have a story told in the language that Egyptian civilization used for its most fundamental truths, a story that located her legitimacy not in the contingent world of politics, where legitimacy could be questioned and challenged and renegotiated, but in the eternal world of divine order, where it was simply what it was. She was building her legitimacy into the same structural register as the legitimacy of every pharaoh who had ever preceded her, and she was doing it on a wall, in stone, where it would be visible to anyone who entered the temple, and impossible to separate from the architecture around it. But here is what makes the birth story at Deir el-Bahari genuinely remarkable beyond its political function. She is the author of it. Previous pharaohs had divine birth narratives. The tradition was not new. What was new was the scale and the specificity and the placement. The decision to put this story at the center of the most ambitious architectural project of the reign, to make it the narrative heart of the building that was supposed to be the defining statement of her rule. She chose what story to tell about herself. She chose how to tell it. She chose what theological arguments to embed in the imagery. In a world where the origin story of a ruler was not a biography but a theological document, she was writing her own theological document. She was deciding who she was in the terms that mattered. Think about what that requires. The confidence to decide that you will not accept the story the existing system would tell about you if left to tell it on its own. The understanding that stories are not discovered but made. The specific insight that in a culture where sacred narrative does real work in the world, the person who writes the narrative is exercising a form of power that outlasts the political moment that generated it. She was writing herself into the permanent record of what Egypt understood the gods to have intended. There is a priest in the temple at Karnak who reads the text of the divine birth narrative for the first time after it is completed. He has spent his career in the Egyptian religious system. He knows how these stories work. He knows what they are doing and why they exist and what they are supposed to accomplish. He is standing in front of something that is doing all of those things with a precision and an ambition that he has not seen before. He has two options. He can read this as a claim that is too large for the person making it, a reach beyond what legitimacy allows, a transgression of the categories that make Egyptian religious life coherent. Or he can read it the way he reads every other divine birth narrative in the tradition, as the truth about the pharaoh, expressed in the language that Egyptian civilization uses for its deepest truths. He is a priest. He has spent his life learning to read sacred texts the way sacred texts are meant to be read. He reads it correctly. He moves on to his next duty. The story is on the wall. The wall is in the temple. The temple is in Egypt. And Egypt, which has been doing this for over 1,000 years, knows exactly what a story on a temple wall means. It means it happened. It means it is real. It means the gods decided, before she was born, that this was who she was supposed to be. The argument was not with her. The argument was with Amun, and no one in Egypt, in the 1500s, before the Common Era, was prepared to have that argument with Amun. There is a morning light in the Valley of the Kings that does not exist anywhere else on earth. It comes in the hour after sunrise, when the sun clears the eastern cliffs and strikes the western face of the mountains that separate the valley from the Nile floodplain. The limestone catches it differently than other stone catches light. It does not simply reflect. It holds the light for a moment, translucent at the surface, in a way that makes the rock seem briefly interior, briefly alive, before the angle shifts and the stone goes back to being stone. Senenmut knew this light. He had studied it, measured it, understood it with the precision of a mathematician who also happened to be a poet, which is the rarest and most useful combination of qualities an architect can possess. He knew when it arrived and how long it lasted, and what it did to color and shadow and the perception of depth on a carved surface. He built Deir el-Bahri to receive it. The temple that Hatshepsut commissioned and Senenmut designed is not the largest building an Egyptian pharaoh ever constructed. The pyramids at Giza are larger. The temples that Ramesses II would build 2 centuries later are more dramatic in their immediate visual impact. By raw scale alone, Deir el-Bahri does not top the list. What it does is something more difficult than scale. It thinks. Every major decision in the design reflects an intelligence that understood not just how to build, but what building was for. The site was chosen because the natural amphitheater of the cliffs behind it would frame the building in a way that no freestanding structure on flat ground could achieve. The three colonnaded terraces rising from the valley floor to the cliff face were designed so that the horizontal lines of the architecture would read as a conversation with the horizontal strata of the geological formations above them. The building does not sit in front of the cliff. It extends from it, as if the cliff itself had decided to express something in the human language of columns and ramps and painted stone, and the orientation, Deir el-Bahri, faces east. Directly east, aligned with a precision that Senenmut achieved through astronomical calculation rather than approximation. Once a year, on the day of the beautiful Feast of the Valley, one of the most important religious festivals in the Theban calendar, the procession of Amun would travel from the Karnak temple complex across the Nile to the West Bank. The processional route brought the divine image of Amun directly to Deir el-Bahri. On that day, at the correct moment in the morning, the rising sun and the approaching procession of the god and the axis of the temple would align. Amun would walk toward a building that was oriented to receive him. This is not aesthetic refinement. This is argument. This is a building making a claim about the relationship between the pharaoh who built it and the god who endorsed her, making that claim in the most permanent medium available, encoding it into the geometry of the structure so that anyone who understood how Egyptian sacred architecture worked would read it immediately and automatically. The pharaoh who built this building is aligned with Amun. The building proves it. The building is the proof. Walk inside. The lower terrace opens onto a wide ramp that leads to the middle terrace, where the colonnades begin in earnest. The columns are proportioned differently from the massive, overwhelming columns of Karnak, which are designed to make the human visitor feel small. These columns are scaled to create a different relationship between the architecture and the person moving through it. You do not feel crushed. You feel accompanied. The scale says, you belong here. On the walls of the colonnaded portico of the middle terrace, in two extended sequences of carved relief, are the two great narrative programs of Deir el-Bahri. On the south side, the divine birth story, the full account of Amun's decision to place Hatshepsut on the throne of Egypt, carved in the careful formal language of Egyptian sacred narrative, painted in colors that have faded across 35 centuries, but were once vivid enough to make the scenes read as immediate, as present, as happening now rather than then. On the north side, the expedition to Punt. The decision to place these two things on facing walls is not a decorative choice. It is a structural argument. The divine birth story is the claim. The Punt expedition is the evidence. Together, they say, look at what the gods chose me to do. Look at what happened when their choice was allowed to operate in the world. Hatshepsut was not modest about her achievements. She should not have been. On the upper terrace, the innermost sanctuaries were carved directly into the cliff face. The rock of the mountain itself became the walls of the most sacred spaces. This was deliberate. The mountain in Egyptian religious thought was not neutral geology. It was the primary burial ground of the gods. The landscape saturated with divine presence. To carve your sanctuary into the living rock was to make your temple continuous with that presence. Deir el-Bahri does not stand before the sacred landscape. It grows from it. There is a man whose name we do not have, one of the many hundreds of skilled workers who spent years cutting and carving and painting the surfaces of Deir el-Bahri. He was a craftsman in the Egyptian tradition, trained in the conventions of a visual language that had been developing for over 1,000 years, capable of producing the formal representations that filled the walls with the dense, organized information that Egyptian monumental art was designed to convey. He was working on the relief panels of the divine birth story on the south wall of the middle terrace. He had done this kind of work before. Religious narratives, ritual scenes, the images of gods and pharaohs in their formal relationships. He knew how these scenes were organized, what the conventions demanded, what a trained viewer would expect to find. One afternoon, he was working on the upper portions of the colonnade wall. The sun was at an angle that illuminated the carved surface in a way that only happened at that hour on that part of the wall. He set down his tools for a moment, the way craftsmen sometimes do when the work requires a moment of assessment. He looked at what he had made. He did not have words for what he saw. He had the visual language of his trade and the technical knowledge of his craft and the immediate physical experience of a man who had been doing hard work in the Egyptian sun. But what he saw, what anyone with eyes would have seen at that moment, was a wall that was not simply decorated. It was alive in the way that the best things made by human hands sometimes achieve a quality that exceeds the intentions of the hands that made them. He picked up his tools. He went back to work. He did not know he was helping build something that would still be standing in 3,500 years. He knew he was cutting good stone in a good building. That was enough. When Deir el-Bahari was finished, Hatshepsut walked through it. She had seen the plans. She had approved every major decision about what would go where and what it would mean. She had made the choices about which stories would be carved into which walls and what each placement would argue to the people who experienced the building and the gods who received it. But there is a difference between knowing a design and standing inside the finished building when the morning light comes through the columns and the geometry of the structure does exactly what it was calculated to do. She walked through the lower terrace and up the ramp to the middle colonnade, and she stopped in front of the south wall, where the divine birth story had been carved from the stone. She stood there in the way that people stand when they are looking at something that is also looking back at them. On the wall was the story she had written about herself, the story of the divine decision, made before she was born, that she was supposed to be here, the story that placed her legitimacy not in the contingent world of political arrangements, but in the eternal world of what the gods had decided. She had written the story. She had commissioned the wall. She had approved the images. And now the images were complete and permanent, and looking back at her from the stone that would hold them, long after every person alive today was gone. What does it feel like to stand in front of the story you wrote about yourself, carved in stone, in a building designed to receive a god, on the wall of the most ambitious argument you have ever made for your own right to exist? No record answers that question. The building stands. That is the record. That is what she left. And here is the thing about a record made in stone, the thing Hatshepsut understood better than almost anyone who came before her, and that the next 35 centuries would confirm in ways she could not have predicted. Stone remembers everything you put into it, including the things you were not trying to say, including the ambition that exceeds what any single rain can contain, including whatever it cost to build something this large, without anyone who had done it before you to tell you whether you were doing it right, including the specific quality of a person standing in front of their own story in stone and feeling, perhaps for the first time, the full weight of what they have made and what making it required. The stone holds all of it, and it does not give any of it back. In the 22nd year of the joint reign, Hatshepsut sent 5 ships to a place called Punt. The ships departed from a port on the Red Sea coast, probably from the harbour that the Egyptians maintained at a site we now call Mersa Gawasis, where archaeologists have found the physical remnants of ancient seafaring operations, including rope, pottery, and cedar planks that were once part of hulls used for exactly this kind of expedition. The ships were large enough for a significant cargo and a substantial crew. They carried trade goods, appropriate for the kind of exchange that Egypt conducted with Punt. Goods the Puntites valued, and that Egypt could offer in exchange for what Punt had and Egypt wanted. The voyage was not the first Egyptian expedition to Punt. The Egyptians had been trading with Punt intermittently for over 1,000 years before Hatshepsut sent her ships. Old Kingdom pharaohs had mounted expeditions. Middle Kingdom pharaohs had maintained the relationship. Punt was not a discovery. What Hatshepsut made of it was, the ships returned loaded with things that the relief carvings at Deir el-Bahari document with a specificity that archaeologists and botanists and historians of ancient trade have spent generations studying. 31 living myrrh trees, their root balls carefully preserved for replanting, intended for the terraced gardens of Deir el-Bahari, where Hatshepsut would plant them as living evidence of the expedition. Ebon, pure ivory, gold, aromatic wood, cinnamon wood, eye cosmetics, apis, monkeys, dogs, the skins of the southern panther, and, as the inscriptions put it, natives and their children. The last item on that list is the most uncomfortable for modern readers. We are looking at a document from 35 centuries ago, produced by a civilization with values and practices that differ from ours in ways that are sometimes extraordinary and sometimes not. The Punt expedition, for all the wonder it contains this too. We note it, and we do not explain it away. But the Punt expedition was not primarily a list of goods. That is the thing Hatshepsut understood, and that her predecessors, who had also traded with Punt, had not grasped in quite the same way. The Punt expedition was a story. She commissioned the most detailed visual record of any Egyptian trading expedition ever made. The relief carvings at Deir el-Bahari that document the voyage run across multiple panels and show not just the goods exchanged, but the journey itself. The ships on the sea. The landscape of Punt, with its distinctive vegetation and houses built on stilts over the water. The people of Punt, including their queen, whose physical description has fascinated and puzzled scholars for generations. The Egyptian officials conducting the exchange with the formal ceremony of representatives of the world's most powerful civilization, meeting representatives of a distant land. She did not just send ships to Punt. She turned the sending of ships to Punt into the most documented single event of her reign. Why? The answer requires understanding what Punt meant to Egypt beyond the commercial value of the goods exchanged. Punt was, in the Egyptian imagination, Ta Natir, the land of the gods, the place where the gods had their origins, where the sacred substances that Egyptian religion required, above all, the myrrh and the other aromatics that burned in the temple ceremonies, came from. To trade with Punt was not simply to acquire luxury goods. It was to maintain a connection with the divine source of the sacred substances that kept Egypt's relationship with the gods functioning. The pharaoh who secured that connection was doing something with theological weight as well as economic weight. Hatshepsut made sure Egypt knew she had secured it. The myrrh trees that came back on her ships were planted in the gardens of Deir el-Bahari, visible to anyone who visited the temple. Living evidence that the expedition had happened and that its fruits, literally, were growing on Egyptian soil. The relief carvings made the journey permanent in stone. The official inscriptions described the expedition in the language of divine endorsement, as something Amun had commanded, and that Hatshepsut had executed in faithful service of the god's will. She was not simply trading with Punt. She was demonstrating that Egypt, under her rule, was connected to the sources of divine power in a way that was active, productive, and bearing fruit The whole country could see. Now here is the thing that makes the Punt expedition complicated, in a way that a straightforward celebration of it does not capture. Hatshepsut's predecessors had extended Egypt through conquest. Thutmose I had gone to the Euphrates with an army. The visual record of his reign, and the reigns of the warrior pharaohs before him, is full of images of military triumph, of enemies defeated and tribute extracted and borders pushed outward through force. Hatshepsut's great outward expression of Egyptian power was 5 ships going to trade. In the terms that Egypt used to measure pharaonic achievement, this was a real difference. The warrior pharaoh, who brought back the spoils of conquered enemies, was a legible image of what a pharaoh was supposed to do. It mapped onto the cosmic role of the pharaoh as the force that subdued chaos and extended order. A trading expedition, however successful, however documented, however theologically framed, was not that image. She knew this. She was not naive about how Egypt read power. She had spent her entire life inside the system that defined what power looked like. She chose the trading expedition anyway. She chose it because it was what she had determined Egypt actually needed at this moment. The country was stable. The treasury was productive. The administrative machinery was functioning. The borders were secure. What Egypt needed was not another military campaign for the sake of demonstrating military capacity. It needed the goods, the connection, the living trees in the garden of the sacred temple. She made a decision based on what was actually needed, rather than what was easiest to make legible as power. That is a harder thing to do than it sounds, because the people who would read the record of her reign, who would evaluate what she had built and decide whether it merited the full honors of a pharaonic legacy, those people were trained to read military achievement as the primary language of pharaonic greatness. Thutmose, who came after her, would go on to become one of the most celebrated military pharaohs in Egyptian history. He mounted 17 military campaigns into the Levant and Nubia. He extended Egypt's borders to their greatest historical extent. He brought back the kind of visual trophies, the lists of conquered cities, the images of defeated enemies, the tribute from terrified vassal states, that the Egyptian tradition read as unambiguous proof of greatness. He was great. The record of his campaigns is one of the most impressive in the ancient world. He was also following a ruler who had spent 20 years making Egypt prosperous and stable and architecturally magnificent and connected to the sacred sources of divine power through trade and temple building and the careful management of a complex civilization. Those two kinds of greatness are not the same kind of greatness, and the kind that leaves obvious images, clean victories, and legible demonstrations of force tends to be the kind that later generations find easiest to honor. On the wall at Deir el-Bahri, the ships of the Punt expedition sail through painted water that has not moved in 35 centuries. The myrrh trees, in their root balls, are being loaded carefully, their living fragility treated with the attention of people who understand that the trees are the point, that what they are carrying is not just cargo, but a decision about what kind of pharaoh Hatshepsut intended to be. The trees she brought back and planted in her temple gardens did not survive to the present. Living things do not last the way stone lasts, but the image of them on the wall has lasted. The voyage is still there. The choice is still visible. She sent ships to trade with the land of the gods when she could have sent soldiers to conquer something closer. That was who she was. History did not always know what to do with that. There is a specific kind of tension that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a confrontation or a declaration or a moment of open conflict that everyone in the room recognizes as the thing that changes everything. It builds the way pressure builds in a closed system, incrementally, invisibly, in the accumulation of small facts that individually mean nothing and collectively mean everything. The co-regency of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III was that kind of tension. On the surface, the formal arrangement was what it had always been. Two names in the royal record, two sets of cartouches appearing on the walls of temples and on administrative documents, and in the ceremonial contexts where Egyptian power made itself visible. Thutmose III as the male heir, the legitimate pharaoh by the patrilineal logic that Egypt also respected. Hatshepsut as the senior co-ruler, the person whose authority had been established over years of regency, and whose name appeared first in the formal ordering that Egyptian convention used to indicate hierarchy. The stone recorded both of them. The stone did not record what it was like to be Thutmose III in those years. He was not a child anymore. By the middle period of the co-regency, he was a young man, educated, trained, capable in the ways that the 18th dynasty trained its warriors and its administrators, which is to say, extensively and with the expectation that the training would produce someone who could actually do the things the training prepared you for. He could fight. The military education of an Egyptian royal heir in this period was not ceremonial. It produced commanders who understood tactics and logistics and the specific problems of moving an army across terrain that did not cooperate with military plans. Thutmose III would eventually become, by most historical assessments, one of the greatest military commanders the ancient world produced. That capacity did not appear from nowhere when he finally took sole control. It was being developed during the co-regency, in the training grounds and the campaigns on the borders and the careful study of military history that was part of any serious Egyptian warrior's education. He was ready, and he was not in charge. There is a version of this story that wants to turn Thutmose III into a figure of suppressed fury, a man simmering through years of unjust displacement, waiting for the moment he could take back what was rightfully his. That version is satisfying in the way that clear moral categories are satisfying. The wronged heir, the usurper on the throne, the eventual restoration of correct order. But that version is both less accurate and less interesting than the truth. Thutmose III served during the co-regency. He held real military and administrative roles. He was not locked away, not sidelined, not treated as a threat to be neutralized. He was being deployed, which means he was being trusted with actual responsibilities in the governance and defense of Egypt. He led military operations. He was present in the ceremonial life of the court. His name appeared on the monuments, but he was always the second name. There is a young military commander in Egypt during this period, a man who served under Thutmose III in one of the campaigns along the borders. He had watched Thutmose III in the field. He had seen him make decisions under pressure, the kind that reveal what a person actually is rather than what the ceremonial record says they are. He had seen a man who was going to be, when the moment came, exactly the kind of pharaoh that a military career required to flourish. A campaign pharaoh, a pharaoh who led from the front and brought back the kind of victories that the Egyptian military tradition understood as the highest expression of pharaonic power. In the evenings, in the conversations that soldiers have when the day's work is done and the official language can be set aside, he asked the question that everyone in the Egyptian military was asking in those years. When nobody had an answer, but everybody understood the question. In Thebes, the machinery of governance continued its work. The buildings went up, the records were kept, the grain moved. The temple ceremonies were performed on their correct schedule. The diplomatic correspondence kept moving. Egypt functioned with the efficiency of an operation that had been managed well for 2 decades. That was her legacy in the practical sense. Not the monuments, not the theology. Stability. The sense that the machinery was running correctly, that Mat was being upheld. She had built the foundation and then built on it, year after year, because stopping was not something she knew how to do. The Egypt that Thutmose III would eventually inherit was not the Egypt he would have inherited if Thutmose II had lived long enough to reign into his son's adulthood. The treasury was fuller. The building program had produced monuments that would stand for millennia. The trade networks were established. The administrative systems were refined. He was going to inherit something extraordinary. And the person who had built the extraordinary thing was still the first name on the cartouche, on a monument from the later period of the co-regency, a dedication inscription at one of the temples associated with both names. The 2 cartouches appear side by side. Hatshepsut on the left, Thutmose III on the right. The stone carver who cut those cartouches was doing his job. He was not thinking about the weight of the 2 names. The decades of history compressed into the ovals of royal protection surrounding each one, the question building silently in the space between them. He cut the stone. 2 names, 1 stone, 1 Egypt, for now. There is a morning in the royal palace at Thebes, sometime in the later years of the reign, when a servant comes to the door of Neferua's rooms and knocks. No one answers. She knocks again. Still nothing. She opens the door carefully, the way you open a door when you are not sure what you are going to find on the other side. And she looks in. The room is empty. Not empty, the way a room is empty when the person who lives in it has stepped out for the morning and will be back before the midday meal. Empty, the way a room is empty when the objects in it are beginning to look like relics rather than belongings. When the specific accumulation of a person's daily life that makes a room feel inhabited has started to lose that quality. Not all at once, but in the gradual way of something that has been happening for longer than anyone has been willing to say out loud. She closes the door. She goes to report what she found, which is nothing, which is the thing that cannot be reported because there is no official language for it. No administrative category that covers the fact that the pharaoh's daughter has stopped being present in the ways that a person with her titles and her ceremonial roles is supposed to be present. Neferua's name will continue to appear in the record for a while after this. In contexts where the administrative machinery requires her to appear, and then it will stop appearing, without ceremony, without explanation, without the kind of formal documentation that marks the end of a significant royal life in the Egyptian record. She will simply be gone. We do not know what happened to Neferua. We do not know when exactly she died, or if she died young, or if she lived to old age in a private obscurity that the formal record had no reason to document. We have her presence in the early and middle years of the reign, and then we have her absence. And between those 2 things, there is a silence that 35 centuries have not filled. What we know is that Hatshepsut was her mother, and whatever happened to Neferua, it happened on Hatshepsut's watch, somewhere in the palace. On the morning when that servant found the empty room and closed the door and went to make her report, there was a pharaoh of Egypt doing the work that pharaohs do, receiving officials, reviewing documents, managing the correspondence that kept the administrative machinery of a major empire moving, performing the ceremonial functions that the religious calendar required. The work did not stop. The work never stopped. But the work was being done by a person who knew what the servant had found. who understood what it meant when a daughter stopped appearing in the record, who had built the most ambitious monuments in the Egyptian world and written herself into the divine record and governed the most powerful civilization on earth for more than 2 decades, and who was now doing all of that in a palace where one of the rooms had become emptier than it used to be. She did not write about it. There is no inscription on any wall, no administrative document, no piece of the Egyptian record that preserves what the Pharaoh of Egypt felt when her daughter disappeared from the account of things. She left the thinking out of the record. She left the stone. Now consider what the stone actually shows. Because if you read it carefully, it tells you something that the absence of explicit testimony cannot. She built more than any pharaoh before her measured against the years of her reign. The scale of the building program, the relentless accumulation of monuments and temples and additions to existing sacred spaces, the sheer quantity of stone that she set in motion across the landscape of Egypt, is not the record of a person who felt secure about the future. It is the record of a person who understood that the future was not guaranteed and was building accordingly. She was the exception. She had always been the exception, and exceptions, by definition, do not become the rule simply by existing. She had not changed the system that produced her impossible position. She had worked within the system, using its own tools and its own logic to make a place for herself that the system had not prepared. But the place was hers, not a structural feature of the system. It was created by her specific combination of bloodline and capability and will and circumstance. When she was gone, the place would not remain. She knew this. The building program suggests she knew this, because you do not build with that urgency if you believe the building is unnecessary. You build with that urgency when you understand that the buildings are the only things that will remain when everything else that sustained your position has dissolved. When the officials who aligned themselves with you, because you were the effective center of power, realign themselves with equal pragmatism, when the effective center moves, when the priests who endorsed your legitimacy perform the ceremonies of whoever comes next, she was an individual. The institution was Egypt, and Egypt had been doing this for over 2,000 years before she was born. There is an evening somewhere near the end. One of the evenings that look like every other evening from the outside. When Hatshepsut walks through Deir el-Bahri alone, she does this sometimes, not often. The temple is a functioning religious institution with priests and rituals and the continuous activity of a sacred space in active use. And the pharaoh does not wander through functioning religious institutions alone as a regular practice. But sometimes, in the hours when the formal day is over and the formal night has not yet begun, she comes. She walks through the lower terrace, up the ramp, into the middle colonnade, where the light is different from the light outside, filtered through stone and column into something quieter, something that belongs specifically to this space and does not exist anywhere else. She stops in front of the south wall. The divine birth story is there. All of it. The full sequence of images she commissioned. The story she wrote about herself in the terms that Egyptian civilization used for its most fundamental truths. Amun deciding. The fragrance filling the room. The child being fashioned by the gods from divine materials. The announcement to the court. The presentation to her father. The recognition. She looks at it. The images look back at her with the formal calm of things that have been made permanent, that do not require anything from the person looking at them, that will be here when that person is gone. She wrote this story. She built this wall. She made herself a truth in the language of truths that Egypt had been making permanent since before the Hyksos came, and the Hyksos were driven out and the 18th dynasty rose from the aftermath, and her father pushed the borders to the Fard, Euphrates, and she was born in a palace in Thebes as the daughter of the most powerful man in the world. All of that is in this wall, and she is standing in front of it as a woman in her 40s or 50s, in a body that is telling her things she is not ready to hear, in a reign that has lasted longer than anyone expected it to last, in a position that no one before her occupied and that no one after her will occupy for many generations. She built this wall so it would speak for her when she was no longer there to speak for herself. She is still there, for now, but the wall is already speaking. It has been speaking since the day Senenmut's workers finished the last carved panel, and the colors were still bright, and the stone was fresh, and the whole argument of this building was new and complete and undeniable. She looks at the image of herself as the God's chosen child, born to be here, born to stand exactly where she is standing right now, in the building she built to make that truth permanent. She looks at it for a long time. Then she turns and walks back through the colonnade and down the ramp and out into the evening air of the west bank of the Nile, where the last light is catching the cliffs the way it always catches the cliffs at this hour, orange and precise and already beginning to fade. The priests inside the temple go about their work. The building stands. She walks back toward the palace. There is still work to do. There is always still work to do. In approximately 1458, before the Common Era, Hatshepsut died. The records do not give us a deathbed scene. They do not give us a final speech or a last decree or a moment that the people around her recognized as the ending of something they would spend the rest of their lives measuring time against. What they give us is the same thing they gave us at so many other crucial moments in her story, which is an absence where a presence used to be, and the need to reconstruct from surrounding evidence what actually happened in the space the absence created. She was somewhere in her 40s or early 50s. In the context of the ancient world, this was not a young death, but it was not a long life either. The physical demands of Egyptian royal life, the ceremonies, the administrative work, the travel that governance of an empire required, the specific pressures of occupying a position that had no precedent and therefore no established protocol for managing its difficulties. These things left marks on bodies that the ancient world did not have the means to address. In 2007, an Egyptologist named Zahi Hawass and a team of researchers using CT scanning technology examined a mummified tooth found in a canopic box bearing Hatshepsut's cartouche. The tooth matched a gap in the jaw of a mummy that had been sitting unidentified in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo for over a century. The mummy, a heavy-set woman of late middle age, showed evidence of bone cancer and possibly skin cancer as well. Among her possessions was a small flask containing a skin lotion whose chemical analysis suggested it was being used to manage a chronic skin condition, one that may itself have contributed to the cancer. The identification is not universally accepted. Mummy identification is a field where certainty is rare and where confident claims have been made and subsequently challenged, often enough that caution is warranted. But the evidence is compelling enough that many scholars now accept it as the most plausible identification available. If it is her, then this is what we know about her death. She was ill for some time before she died. Bone cancer is not a sudden ending. It is a long ending, the kind that gives a person time to know what is coming. She was managing pain with the means available to the ancient world, which were real means. The Egyptian medical tradition was sophisticated by ancient standards, but they were not sufficient means. She was a pharaoh of Egypt, and she was dying the way people die, which is to say, without exemption, without the intervention of the gods she had spent her life serving, without the divine protection that the texts on her temple walls declared was hers. The divine birth story said the gods chose her before she was born. The bone evidence says the gods did not spare her. What the gods do not spare anyone. She died, and Thutmose III became, for the first time in his life, the sole ruler of Egypt. He was somewhere in his early 30s. He had been the second name on the cartouche for most of his adult life. The transition was smooth in the way that transitions in Egypt were designed to be smooth, because the Egyptian system had over 2,000 years of experience managing the transfer of divine kingship from one body to another, and had developed the ceremonies and the administrative procedures that made the transfer feel continuous rather than disruptive. The pharaoh died. The pharaoh lived. The divine kingship moved from the body that had housed it to the body that would house it next. Ma was maintained. Thutmose III began to govern. What he inherited was extraordinary in the most straightforward material sense. The treasury that Hatshepsut's careful administration had maintained was functional, not depleted. The administrative systems were running with the efficiency of an operation managed well for 2 decades. The temples were among the most magnificent Egypt had ever produced. The borders were secure. The trade relationships were intact. He had inherited an Egypt that worked. He could not have said honestly that this was not in large part because of what she had built. Now here is where the story of Thutmose III becomes more complicated and more interesting than the version that simply makes him the villain of what follows. He was a serious man. The evidence of his reign, which would become one of the longest and most consequential in Egyptian history, is the evidence of a ruler who took his responsibilities with genuine seriousness. He understood what Egypt was and what it required of the person at its center, and he applied himself to those requirements with a thoroughness that produced results. He mounted 17 military campaigns into the Levant and Nubia over the course of his reign. He extended Egypt's borders to their greatest historical extent. He built extensively, adding to and modifying the temples that defined the Egyptian religious landscape, including the temples Hatshepsut had built. He maintained the administrative systems that kept the Egyptian state functioning. He conducted diplomacy with the powers of the ancient world from a position of genuine strength, because the Egypt he governed was genuinely strong. He was a great pharaoh. He was also a man who had grown up as the second name on the cartouche, who had spent his formative years watching someone else occupy the central position of Egyptian governance, who had been prepared for a role and then had the preparation extended year after year, while the person who was supposed to be holding the throne warm for him showed no signs of being willing to put it down. He did not move against her while she lived. Whatever his private calculations, whatever he felt in the years when his name was always the second name, he served. He waited. He did his work. She died. He governed. He walked through the temples she had built. He used the administrative systems she had refined. He spent the treasury she had filled on campaigns that would define his legacy. He added his own name to monuments that bore hers. He moved through an Egypt shaped by Hatshepsut, the way a person moves through a house built by someone else, adjusting some things, keeping others, gradually making it his own, without quite being able to erase the fact that he did not build it. He was building his own legacy now. It was going to be a great legacy. But there was a question that the practical usefulness of what she had left him did not resolve. What did Egypt do with the memory of what had just happened? How did the most powerful civilization in the ancient world, a civilization whose understanding of legitimacy and continuity and the correct operation of divine kingship was woven into the fabric of its religious and political life. How did it account for the 2 decades that had just passed? How did it tell the story of the 18th dynasty in a way that made sense in the terms that Egyptian civilization used to make sense of things? The story, as the record currently presented it, had a problem. It had a woman in the middle of it, a woman who had held the full titles and the full imagery of the pharaoh, a woman whose name appeared in the places where only the names of kings were supposed to appear, in a sequence that was supposed to represent the unbroken line of divine kingship moving forward through time. Thutmose III looked at this problem and did not act on it immediately. He governed, he campaigned, he built, he let years pass, and then more years. He was thinking about something that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with what happened after he was gone. Here is the fact that changes everything about how you read what happened next. The erasure of Hatshepsut from the Egyptian record did not happen immediately after her death. It happened decades later. Thutmose III ruled for approximately 32 years after Hatshepsut died. He mounted his campaigns, he built his monuments, he governed Egypt with the seriousness and the capability that his long preparation had produced. And for the first 2 decades or so of his sole reign, the images and inscriptions of Hatshepsut remained largely intact on the walls and monuments of Egypt. He saw them every time he walked through Deir el-Bahri. He saw them every time he passed through Karnak, where her obelisks still stood covered in electrum, where her cartouche appeared in the inscriptions of buildings she had constructed or modified or added to. He left them for years. He left them, and then, in the latter portion of his reign, when he was an older man who had governed Egypt successfully for decades, who had secured the borders and extended the empire and established a legacy that no one could dispute, he began the process of removing her. The timing matters enormously. A man acting from immediate fury does not wait 20 years. A man acting from wounded pride does not spend 2 decades building one of the most impressive military and administrative records in Egyptian history before getting around to addressing the insult to his dignity. The man who began the erasure was not the young heir who had spent years as the second name. He was an older man, a successful pharaoh, a ruler whose own legacy was secure enough that it did not require the removal of a predecessor to look impressive. He was a man thinking about what happened after he died. Specifically, he was thinking about succession. He had sons. He had an heir. That heir would need to step into the role of pharaoh with the full support of the theological and administrative apparatus that made Egyptian kingship function. The succession needed to be legible. The story of the 18th dynasty needed to make sense in the terms that Egyptian civilization used to make sense of things. And the story of the 18th dynasty, as the record currently presented it, had that problem he had been sitting with for 20 years. King lists in ancient Egypt were not simply historical documents. They were theological documents. They were the record of the correct operation of divine kingship through time. The evidence that Ma'at had been maintained, that the gods had always had a legitimate representative on the throne of Egypt, that the line of succession was what it was supposed to be. A woman in the king list was not simply an anomaly. She was a disruption of the theological argument the king list was making. She was evidence that the line had not proceeded the way the line was supposed to proceed, that something had happened that the official theological narrative of Egyptian kingship did not have a clean way to account for. The deviation was now 20 years in the past. The woman who had caused it was dead. Her legacy was intact in the physical landscape of Egypt. in the buildings she had built, and the trade she had conducted, and the administration she had run. But the king list needed to be clean, and making the king list clean required removing her name from it, which required removing her from the record more broadly. Because you could not simply delete a name from a list when the same name appeared on the walls of temples and monuments across the country. So Thutmose III undertook the systematic removal. Workers with tools went to the monuments of Hatshepsut's reign and chiseled her cartouche from the inscriptions, replacing it, in some cases, with the cartouche of Thutmose I or Thutmose II, the male pharaohs of the immediately preceding generation. Her images were removed from walls where they appeared in the specifically pharaonic imagery. The temples she had built were not destroyed, because destroying them would have destroyed the religious function they served and the divine endorsement they represented. But her presence in them was reduced wherever it could be reduced, without damaging the architecture. The obelisks at Karnak presented a specific problem. They were large. They were prominent. They were covered in electrum and inscriptions that made her identity clear to anyone who approached them. Destroying them would have been an enormous undertaking. And the obelisks themselves were sacred objects whose destruction would have had religious implications he was not willing to court. His solution was precise in a way that revealed exactly what he was actually trying to accomplish. He built walls around them, the tops of the obelisks, visible. Above the walls he constructed, continued to catch the light and announce themselves to anyone in the vicinity of Karnak. But the inscriptions at the base, the ones that recorded her name and her titles and the specific claims she had made about her relationship with Amun, those inscriptions were now enclosed within a structure that restricted access to them. He was not trying to make her invisible, he was trying to make her illegible. Here is the distinction that matters. A pharaoh who wanted to erase a predecessor out of personal anger would destroy the buildings. He did not destroy the buildings. He maintained them, used them, added to them in some cases, continued to operate them as the religious institutions they were. What he was doing was more specific. He was removing her from the formal categories of legitimate pharaonic succession. He was making it possible to tell the story of the 18th dynasty without accounting for the deviation. He was cleaning up the king list for the sake of his successors, who would need that list to be coherent, who would need the theological argument it made to be sound. He was not saying she had not existed. He was saying she had not been pharaoh. The difference between those two statements is the difference between an act of personal fury and an act of political housekeeping. And it is the difference that explains both why the erasure happened when it did and why it was as incomplete as it turned out to be. Because here is what Thutmose III did not fully calculate. He was operating on documents and cartouches and the visual language of the official monumental tradition. He understood that language, he had spent his entire life inside it. What he did not fully account for was what happened to the things you bury. The statues of Hatshepsut that were removed from Deir el-Bahri and from the approaches to the temple were not destroyed, the way a conqueror destroys the monuments of a defeated enemy. They were broken, they were damaged, they were removed from their positions, and then they were buried in the pits near Deir el-Bahri, in the rubble fills of construction projects, under the floors of buildings, in the places where things go when the people disposing of them want them gone, but do not want the violence of complete destruction. The burial was practical. Stone is heavy. Moving it entirely out of the area was an enormous undertaking that was not necessary for the purpose, which was simply to remove her image from the prominent positions where it had been visible. So the statues were broken, and the broken pieces were buried nearby, and the burial was the end of it. Except it was not the end of it. It was the beginning of it, buried in dry Egyptian soil in the absence of the moisture and the oxygen that would have degraded them over time. The broken statues of Hatshepsut were being preserved, not intentionally, not by anyone's design, by the accident of disposal, by the pragmatic decision to put the pieces somewhere out of sight rather than transport them somewhere completely away, by the specific properties of dry desert soil that is extraordinarily good at keeping things exactly as they are. The fire that burned Nineveh baked Ashurbanipal's clay tablets into permanence. The walls Thutmose III built around Hatshepsut's obelisks protected the base inscriptions from the weathering that would have damaged them in open air. The pits that received her broken statues became, across 35 centuries, the most complete archive of her image that could possibly have been constructed. He tried to make her illegible. He made her permanent. The scale of the irony is almost impossible to sit with fully. A man of genuine intelligence, genuine political sophistication, genuine historical awareness, undertook a systematic and careful program to remove a person from the formal categories that Egyptian civilization used to define what was real and what had happened and who had mattered, and the method he chose, the specific practical decisions he made about how to accomplish the removal, produced the opposite of what he intended. She is more recoverable today because he buried the pieces than she would have been if he had left them standing and the centuries had worn at them in the open air. The erasure is why we can find her. The attempt to make her go away is the primary reason she came back. There is a worker, a man whose name we do not have, who was employed in the operation of removing and disposing of the statuary from Deir el-Bahari during the later years of Thutmose III's reign. He was doing what he was told, the way workers in every era do what they are told, without necessarily knowing the full context of the instruction or the full implications of the action. He picked up a piece of carved limestone, a fragment of a royal face, formal in the Egyptian style, with the careful lines around the eye that had been painted and carved in this valley for 1,000 years. He carried it to the pit with the other pieces. He put it in. He did not know what he was doing. He thought he was disposing of something. He was archiving it. He filled in the pit. He went home. He went back to work the next day, 3,500 years later. An archaeologist named Herbert Winlock, working at Deir el-Bahari in the 1920s and 1930s, excavated those pits and found the pieces. Thousands of them, fragments of statues that, reassembled with the patience and the expertise of modern conservation work, produced some of the most complete images of Hatshepsut that we have. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York now has a gallery dedicated to these statues. People walk through it every day. They see her face, the formal profile of a pharaoh in the Egyptian style, looking at something that the angle of the gaze places just outside the frame of the image. She is looking at something we cannot see. She has been looking at it for 35 centuries. The man who tried to make her invisible put her in a museum. He did not know he was doing that. He thought he was solving a problem. He was creating a record, and the record, as she had understood, and as he had understood, in his own way, outlasts the intention of the person who made it. Stone remembers. It always remembers. It does not ask permission. It does not consult the king list. It simply holds what was put into it and waits for someone with the patience and the tools and the desire to understand, to come and find it. She built to be found. She was found. Luxor, 1903. Howard Carter is still standing in front of the wall. He is holding the fragment of limestone he picked up from the debris at his feet, the piece with the carved face on it. The face, looking at something just outside the frame of the image. He has been holding it long enough that the stone has taken on a little of the warmth of his hand, which is a strange thing to notice, but he notices it anyway. He does not know her name yet. He knows the shape of what is missing. He knows the erasure was deliberate and careful and organized and done by people with the resources to do it correctly. He knows that whoever stood in the spaces that were cut out of this wall was powerful enough that the record of an entire civilization was adjusted to accommodate their absence. That is what he knows in 1903. What comes next takes years. It takes the excavation of pits near Deir el-Bahri that yield thousands of fragments of broken statues. It takes Herbert Winlock working through those fragments in the 1920s and 30s, reassembling them in the storerooms of what will eventually become the Metropolitan Museum of Art collection. It takes the patient work of scholars learning to read the formal language of Egyptian monumental art and the informal language of administrative documents and the archaeological language of objects buried in desert soil with specific intention. It takes a tooth, a mummified tooth found in a canopic box bearing her cartouche, matched to the jaw of a mummy that sat unidentified in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo for over a century, and a CT scanner, and a small flask of ancient skin lotion analyzed by researchers who were not born until more than 3,000 years after the woman who used it died. All of that comes later. Right now, there is just a man standing in front of a wall in the early light of an Egyptian morning, holding a piece of carved limestone, understanding that something important happened here, and that what happened here has not finished happening yet. He sets the fragment down carefully in the place where things are set when their importance is not yet fully understood. He goes back to the wall. Now we know whose face it was. Her name was Hatshepsut. The name means something like foremost of noble women. It was the name given to her at birth. Before anyone knew what she would become, she took a throne name, Mardkare. Truth is, the soul of Ra. When she became pharaoh in the full sense, that was the name she used in the royal cartouche, the name that carried the theological weight of the pharaonic role, the name that the chisels of Thutmose III's workers were instructed to remove from the walls and the monuments and the king list and the formal record of what Egypt understood itself to have been. It did not fully work. She is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The statues that Thutmose III's workers put in the pit at Deir el-Bahri have been reassembled as fully as the available fragments allow, and they look at you from behind the glass of a dedicated gallery with the formal calm of the Egyptian royal portrait tradition, which is to say, they look at you as if they have been waiting for you specifically, and are not surprised you finally arrived. She is in the temple of Deir el-Bahri, which is still standing on the west bank of the Nile, which still receives the morning light through its columns, which still carries on its walls the divine birth story and the Punt expedition and the architectural argument that she spent years constructing. The paint has faded. Some of the images have been damaged by the centuries and by the people who used the building for purposes she did not design it for. But the structure stands. The orientation still aligns with the east. On the correct day, in the correct season, the light still does what Senenmut calculated it would do. She is in the question. Her story keeps generating. The question that has been asked in different forms, in different languages, in different centuries since the moment scholars first pieced together enough of the fragments to understand what they were looking at. How did she do it? Not as a question of technique, as a question of something deeper. How does a person inhabit a position that the world around them has determined they cannot hold? How do you make a system accept something it was not designed to accept, using only the tools the system itself provides? How do you build something permanent enough to outlast the people who wanted to make you temporary. She answered those questions in stone. The stone is still there. But here is the thing that no excavation and no reassembly and no CT scanner has been able to recover. We do not know what she thought about in the part of the day that was not the formal record. We do not know what it felt like to stand in the preparation room the night before she first walked out as Pharaoh in the full costume of the role, alone with the polished bronze and the pieces assembled on the table. We do not know what she said to Neferura, or what she felt on the morning when she understood that the room was empty and was going to stay empty. We do not know what she thought when she stood in front of the south wall of Deir el-Bahri and looked at the story she had written about herself in stone and felt the full weight of what making that story permanent had required. We do not know what she called herself in the part of herself that was not the pharaoh. The Egyptian language did not have a word for what she was. She had to use male pronouns and female pronouns in the same inscription. She had to hold two grammatical identities simultaneously in a language that wanted her to choose one. Modern languages are not much better. We call her the female pharaoh, which is technically accurate and almost entirely insufficient. We say she was ahead of her time, which is a phrase that means we do not know what time she was actually of, and that our time does not entirely know what to do with her either. She exceeds the categories. She always exceeded the categories. That was the whole problem. That was the whole point. Carter sets down the fragment with the carved face. The face looks up at the Egyptian sky with the formal calm of an image that was made to last and has lasted and is not done lasting yet. The morning light is coming in over the eastern cliffs. In a little while, when the angle is right, the limestone will hold the light the way this limestone holds light. Briefly, interior, briefly alive, as if there is something inside the stone that the light recognizes and stops to acknowledge before the angle shifts and the stone goes back to being stone. Senenmut calculated that moment. He built a temple to receive it. She commissioned the temple. She walked through it. She stood in front of the wall where her story was carved, and she looked at what she had made, and then she turned away and went back to work, because there was always still work to do. She is still in the wall. She is still in the pits where the broken pieces waited 3,500 years for someone to find them. She is still in the formal face, looking at something just outside the frame. The something that the angle of the gaze places precisely where we are standing when we look at her. She is looking at us. She has been looking at us this whole time. The stone could not forget her. The stone never forgets anything. It just waits for someone to ask the right question. She was Tambek question. She still is.